So good morning. I'm Elaine Treharne. I'm at Stanford University, and I'm really privileged to be talking about archives and libraries with Professor Andrew Prescott, who is in Llannon in Wales. And Professor Prescott did his research as a PhD student on the judicial records of the revolt of 1381 before becoming a curator in historical manuscripts and documents of the British Library until the year 2000, when he took up a role as the director for the Centre for Research into Freemasonry at the University of Sheffield, and then moved to be the librarian at the University of Wales, Lampeter. The large kind of explosion of research and work in digital humanities led to Professor Prescott taking up professorial and managerial roles, both at King's College London and now as a professor of digital humanities in the School of Critical Studies at the University of Glasgow. I'm so pleased that you're here to talk to me, Andrew, about archives and libraries. And what's, I suppose, a first question, looking at your own track record as a historian, as a historical curator, as a librarian, and now as digital humanities, is how your own career kind of exemplifies all of the richness of the archival library scholar world. And so, I mean, the very first question is, how have you been coping with the lockdown, given that lots of your research actually takes place in a place like your background in archives and libraries? How has lockdown been?
I've been very fortunate. I've been in an area of Wales where the impact of the pandemic has been very limited because it's a very rural area. A lot of the work I'm doing at the moment is going back to some of my PhD research on the records of 1381, which are available online, and we're putting a lot of that material onto a database. So I'm able to use my existing transcripts and the digital materials. So, I haven't felt particularly constrained from the point of view of carrying on with my existing projects. One or two things have gone by the wayside inevitably, but they probably would have got delayed anyway. So I haven't felt that a particular constraint. What I've noticed I have missed, and it's been a real privation for me, has been that I like working in libraries as working spaces. And that's kind of interesting because I think that's one of the big shifts that's taken place in libraries over the past 10 to 15 years, is an awareness of the importance of libraries as shared spaces and spaces for quiet reflection and study, and for social study. I think you particularly notice that if you go to the British Library, where you see all these people who aren't in the reading rooms, but who are working in the British Library, and who obviously value it as a space. It's that space that I particularly missed in the pandemic. And that's something that librarians have become much more conscious of in recent years. It poses a particular issue that I think for archivists and special collections librarians, because obviously the idea of kind of free and easy spaces, which libraries have been exploiting more generally, is much more difficult in an archival context. How you deal with that is a complex issue.
And I think we'll talk about the sort of distinctions between archives and libraries, I think, during the course of this discussion. But how did you become, or why did you become? It's difficult to describe you, really, isn't it? But a sort of archives library scholar. So how did you move into this field from your PhD?
Yeah, I've been quite fortunate. I was quite fortunate in that I think I was able really to carve out a career at the tail end of what's really a 19th century tradition of people working across archives and the curation of archives and historical research. And what really got me interested in that was my original postgraduate work on the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the famous revolt associated with people like Wat Tyler and John Ball. And fundamentally for that research, what I did was to really conduct the first extensive survey of the central judicial records of the prosecution of the rebels, held in the National Archives in London. I became fascinated both by the way that there was this very rich, often very colourful documentation of an event where ordinary people are very much getting involved in archives, and it's the way archives enable us to approach the lives of ordinary people that I find particularly fascinating, but also by the way in which the historical information was mediated by the administrative structures and the legal structures that generated the records, which at one level was very interesting for the way in which, if you understood those administrative structures, you could navigate your way around the material and anticipate where things might be. But also at another level, because these people who hadn't had a voice, whose voice had been lost, a voice was there, but it was being heavily mediated in different ways by judicial records. And the way in which archives, the structure of archives, affected that for us, I found profoundly fascinating. And it was that made me really want to work with archives. And it was by the happenstance of getting jobs that I ended up in the British Library rather than in the National Archives. And it was interesting to see how that engagement with the archives was very different, working with a different type of library collection with the British Library, and how the mediation there is different. So it's that mediation that's always been the theme. And although it sounds like I've worked across a lot of things, in essence, even with the work with Freemasonry, it's about understanding those power structures and the way in which those power structures shape the historical record. That's really been what my career has been about.
Wonderful. That's really wonderful. And I've just finished rereading Arlette Farge's The Translation of the Allure of the Archives, where she talks about the French police records, judicial records in the 18th century. And, you know, that's what she's saying, is that she's trying to find echoes or traces of the voices of people who normally don't get into the record, and she finds them through these transcripts. And she says you have to dig deep for the meaning. I think we can agree there's probably multiple meanings to be found, but I think the point she doesn't make as strongly or perhaps sustainedly is the one that you have just made, the key point about about how mediated these voices are.
Yeah, and it comes over very powerfully in the case of the 1381 revolt, where Stephen Justice has written a very famous book about the revolt, arguing that that you can use the monastic chronicles, even though these are acts of suppression of those voices, as a means of reading against them in order to get the voice out. But actually that also equally works with the legal records. But you're hearing those voices at 3 or 4 removes and translated into formal legal jargon. And how that process works is what kind of fascinates me in terms of understanding how the archive works. For example, one of the materials I worked on, I was very interested in, were the files with the original working documents from the 14th century, which had recently, when I was working in the National Archives as a student, had recently been recovered from sacks underneath the reading rooms, which hadn't been examined for centuries. And you could see by comparing the original file documents with what the scribes had put in the final plea rolls, this process of re-authoring and reshaping the original testimonies that were coming through from particular witnesses, which were already probably at 1 remove. Yeah. So that process I find fascinating. The problem is, as one of my historian colleagues put it to me, he said, I tend to come up with you can't really believe what you say a bit too often. I think that is a problem, is that actually what you're as much interested in, and I think Arlette Farge talks about this very eloquently, is that sense of immersion in the archives, a sense of engaging with that process, but to the point where it becomes a kind of never-ending process of exploration and a kind of total immersion. And that's an issue, I think, with anyone who works on archives, partly because I think the sheer scale, this is really what I've found with my postgraduate research, and it's something that's been an issue for me almost ever since, is the sheer quantity of what I came up with, which even then is only the tip of the iceberg.
Right. Yeah. No, I quite understand that. And actually, your Zoom background kind of demonstrates that really well. All those scrolls that you've got on those shelves there.
They're all statutes. This the virtual background is the statute room in the House of Lords, which are vellum copies of statutes. But this is pretty well, that's why I selected it, pretty well the sort of thing that I was working on as a postgraduate.
Wow, brilliant. So actually, even then, either then or now, is there a skill that you wish you had that you didn't have at the time, or you still don't have? Is that what skill?
I think fundamentally, always the thing I particularly regret is that I'm not better at languages, and my Latin is self-taught. I was just at the point where they were dropping Latin, and I wish it were better than it is, and that would give me more confidence as an editor. But I think anybody working in archives, it would be very good to have a wider range of other languages as well. I've always regretted not having German. I'd like more Romance languages, and it's probably good that I don't have Greek, because it will get me off into areas that I don't, never-ending areas. But I think linguistic formation, although language is always something you can acquire, is something I really would like more of.
Right, and I think even that response just, I mean, it shows that one of the things about the archive, so let's just say in Britain and then narrow it to England, it was always a multilingual, it's always been a multilingual society.
The earliest report, a colleague of mine had just been working on it, the earliest narrative report of the 1381 revolt is in Old German by the Hansa merchants.
Oh, wow, wonderful. Wow, that's brilliant. Proves the point. Marvellous. So, obviously, you've worked in many different collections as a curator, and you've had access to many different collections. What do you think? What would you say is the most significant archival or library object that you've worked on?
It's never. I've been I must count myself very fortunate in having handled and been involved with all sorts of very famous manuscripts from Magna Carta, Gulston Salter. I've seen Doomsday Book out of its case, so that's very fortunate. And actually, one of the most spectacular things I did when I did a book with Elizabeth Hallam on a selection of photographs of historic documents from the British Library and National Archives, was we looked at the Jack the Ripper letters, which are so sensitive that even very senior curators have to look at them under closed circuit television in locked room. But actually, they don't really stick out in my mind as much as the smaller objects, because I think the fascination of archives, as I've indicated, is not so much the glamorous manuscripts, the celebrity manuscripts that we hear so much about. It's the smaller, the overlooked, and the half-forgotten manuscripts which are fascinating. Working with those files from the sacks underneath the reading room, which were documents that had come in from all over the country in the 14th century, gave me a buzz in a way that is, to me, more exciting than working with the most glamorous illuminated manuscript. And I was thinking about this earlier, and one where all that really came together in a very satisfactory way, was a big problem at the British Library, and a problem generally, is that as a result of the effects of sale rooms, of donation, of Victorian rationalisation of collections, is that the archival structures have been disrupted and destroyed often, so that those sense of how you can navigate around things that you get with a purer archive like the National Archives isn't so evident in the British Library. But you can still find sort of clumps of stuff that are still archival in their character and where you can judge the provenance. I was aware that there was a little clump I was quite interested in, which belonged to somebody who was the Mayor of London in the late 14th century, controversial Mayor of London, but also a manor in Tottenham. And this mayor had sort of loose connections with Chaucer. And when Estelle Stubbs was working on the Adam Pinkhurst connection with Lynn Mooney, Adam Pinkhurst obviously being claimed as Chaucer's scribe and the scribe of the Hengert manuscript of the Canterbury Tales and the Ellesmere manuscript of the Canterbury Tales, I suggested it might be worthwhile Estelle having a look in this completely neglected little cache of charters in the British Library. And indeed, she identified one of those charters as being in the hand of Adam Pinkhurst. And that charter in the British Library, fairly nondescript charter, is in fact one of the things that even Lawrence Warner, who's a severe critic of some of the identifications, has accepted is almost certainly in the hand of Adam Pinkhurst. It's those little things that stick in the mind as much as the more glamorous things, which I've been very privileged to touch and use from time to time.
Do you think that's partly as a result of? Is there a natural inclination in this kind of work to? Well, I suppose there must be, to make a discovery, and you're much more likely to make a discovery in the half-forgotten clumps of things than you would be looking at a manuscript that's been looked at and looked at and looked at for decades. This making a discovery thing, which I think maybe as a result of the pressure on academics to demonstrate the impact and value of their research, means that we've had a sort of wealth of media, news, and television celebration of discoveries. Adam Pinkhurst is probably an example in himself. It means that whole issue of making discoveries has seemed to me to got really out of hand in recent years. For me, that's never the motivation of going to the archives, partly because you come across so much stuff that you've got no chance of following it all up. I came across in my postgraduate research in the late 14th century allegations that somebody called Long Will had been involved in an assault in Derbyshire, which I kind of just put to one side, but didn't think anything more of it. But somebody else has subsequently put the work in to claim that it could possibly be identified with William Langland, the author of Piers Plowman. You come across these things so frequently, I think at a certain point you're not interested in making discoveries in that way. I think what is, for me, the thing that beguiles me about this material is the sense of engagement with past life. I think everybody's felt that, and no matter what the difficulties and deceptions of that, the sense that you're in close contact. Also, a fascination for the way in which everything works and locks together, and the way in which archives function, and actually understanding the way in which archives function. And it's that I find particularly beguiling. So that in the case example I gave of the charter by Pinkhurst in the British Library, what interested me was more that there was this small clump of material in the midst of a great random systematized miscellany
of charters in the British Library, actually understanding how you can identify that clump. That's what really excites me. That's why I found the work I did on the restoration of the Cotton manuscripts very interesting, not because it resulted in great discoveries, but because it made me understand the process that the manuscripts had been through.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. And you know, when you talked about the Jack the Ripper letters, and you know the names that you come across in these in these documents, and then the process itself. Have you ever had to make or be part of a discussion where there's an ethical dilemma in the material or in the way that you present, whatever? Have you ever had to make?
It does come up a lot. One of the things, I mean, part of it, fortunately, because there's a difference between what you might do in an archive and what you might do in somewhere like the British Library. By and large, in the British Library, you're either paying in order to get the thing in because you're buying it in a sale room, or somebody's donating it to you and you're willing to accept the donation. Whereas in a conventional archive, you're dealing with the administrative output of a corporate body. And the issue is more about what you keep and what you throw away, because you can't keep everything. So in those cases, you are confronted with dilemmas of the sort that confronted the National Archives some years ago, when they disposed of the passenger lists for people emigrating to North America in the early stage, because they didn't fit in with the administrative parameters. And people working with administrative archives are confronted with that issue, dealing with quantity all the time. I've never had to deal with that on a large scale. I've never worked in that sort of archive in a professional capacity. Whereas in somewhere like the British Library, it's actually, you sort of half made the choice by deciding to buy the thing, and that takes you around the dilemma at the beginning. But nevertheless, they come up, and they particularly come up around the issue of closure. So we had a set of papers donated relating to a film director, and there were some very difficult and sensitive papers about a divorce which involved somebody who was still alive, and my recommendation was that they should be closed for a period of 50 years, so the historical records preserved, and the damage to reputations and personal difficulties are avoided, which is a fairly conventional thing to do. The donor was very keen that the world should know about what had happened, and was quite keen for the documents to go straight out, but they were closed. And issues around closure are always quite sensitive and interesting. One of the things that happened while I was at the library is that the diary of Anthony Blunt, the famous British spy, was de-reserved and became publicly available, but when examined contained very little of interest, in fact.
As is the way sometimes. So you've just talked about, that's a very interesting distinction between archives and libraries, is the element of selection, you know, before you obtain objects through selection.
Archivists, the main job of most archivists is working out what's thrown away. It's not working out what's kept.
So then this issue of quantity, which has come up a number of times, now that we're we are thoroughly immersed in the digital age, or whatever you want to call it. Obviously, in terms of deluge of data, this is the moment. And so how do you anticipate the effect of the digital, and you can interpret this in any way that you want, the effect of the digital on libraries and archives, perhaps now and going forward?
I mean, I think there's going to be a difference in emphasis. And again, it's going to reflect the traditions of the two different activities. In the case of an archive like the National Archive, the issue is going to be, how do you preserve a digital record of government activities for the future? How, if you're an economic historian and you want to work out how the furloughing support that's been given to employers during the pandemic, how that was operated, how that's worked. It's all run through the national insurance system. It's all going to be online. Their historians for hundreds of years to come are going to require access to aggregates generated from the tax system. How do you even collect, and how do you make that information available for a long period of time? And that's going to involve not just a lot of management of digital record keeping systems, electronic record keeping systems, but probably get you into areas of basically computer science. If you think about tax or police records, if they're kept online, similar to the case I just described, you might well want to keep those closed for 100 years. You might want individual police records not to be available for 100 years. If that's an online record, how on earth do you know you're going to be able to open it in 100 years' time and it will still work? If we've got a file, you know you can open it in 100 years' time and you'll still be able to read it. But if it's a 100-year-old computer file, how can we do it in such a way that you can be sure that it's still going to be readable? It's likely you may need to perform some checks, and one of the jobs of the archivists will be able to work out what level of check on a digital file is appropriate if one wants to maintain those sorts of security things. I think it's going to get us in archives and much more into areas of computer science. There's quite a bit of work already taking place around blockchain, distributed ledger technology for validating archives. Those are going to be issues. You compare that with libraries, I think their preoccupations will also become far more digitally oriented, but perhaps in a different direction, and they might move far more into forensics. So the example, it seems to me, the sort of thing that more and more we're going to have to do is the Salman Rushdie archive, which included a large amount of digital material. Amongst the material that was deposited in the archive were a couple of Macs, including, I think, the one that the Satanic Verses was written on, which had coffee spilt all over it. And there was a major project to actually get the hard disk working again and then emulate how that early Mac appeared in order to reconstruct Salman Rushdie's data for the composition of that novel. I think we're going to be wanting to do much more of that, from which you'll understand that my feeling is that our emphasis in the future has to be far more on dealing with thinking about born digital materials than it is about digitizing the sorts of roles you can see behind me. I mean, that's been our preoccupation over the past 30 years or so, 30 or 40 years. But really, the challenge that confronts everybody is dealing with the swathes of born digital material that are coming our way.
So, you know, when I think about listening to you, it does sound to me to be sort of a slightly mind-boggling set of problems that are emerging in archival and library profession as a whole. And reading Louise Craven's essay in what is an archive? Is that the name of the book? You've got an essay. Yeah, you've got an essay in it. This was written in 2004. This was published in 2004. That book, which is 16 years ago. Doesn't seem like 5 minutes, but in that essay, she talks about the fact that in 2004, archives is the big thing, partly because of the explosion in genealogical studies and programs like, what's that program about your family? Who do you think you are?
Yeah.
On the television. And I would say that in the last 16 years since the publication of that book, if anything, the idea of the archive and the library for the populace at large has become even more significant. Why is that, do you think?
I think it's partly. I mean, it's partly one thing that's worth bearing in mind is that it's partly very successful marketing by archivists themselves, who work very closely with family historians in order to generate that interest in the archive. In the 1980s, when we became much more conscious about user figures and user levels, the kind of old style reliance on a few record agents and doddery researchers in order to justify the resources put into archives weren't really sufficient. And I think the engagement of with family historians, the encouragement of family history by archivists was a very good move in order to ensure that in a period of financial constraint in the public sector, resources continue to come that way. However, obviously, it speaks to much deeper feelings, and I think I'd probably be inclined towards a wider sociological view of the feeling of people in very unsettled times wanting to get some reassurance about their identity and their roots. But I mean, it is big business, and that's constantly worth bearing in mind. It has been said in a number of studies, I don't know whether there's any detailed information to back this up, that after pornography, family history is the second biggest activity on the web. Whether that's the case, really, I don't know, but certainly when you look at firms like Ancestry.com, Find My Past, it's big business.
Yes.
And that's part of what the archivist has to deal with, in the sense that it means there's also financial pressure for them, for archivists, to make available their materials via those routes, which are privatized and constrained routes.
And because I have a collection of personal archives from people, that I find in antique shops and online sort of auction sites, and then students and I work together on kind of thinking about the voices contained within those personal archives. You really have to subscribe to all of these things in order to get coverage of the major collections and lists of documents that you're likely to need.
It's a huge problem, and it fascinates me. It's to do with the canonicity of materials. The major historic archive groups are being made available via Ancestry.com, Find My Past. Because these aren't readily available via university systems, they tend to be overlooked by academics unless they take out personal subscriptions, and they kind of fall off the radar. Rate books are a example. Rate books are kind of one of the great historic archive series in England and Wales, recording house property taxes right the way back to the 17th century, and are very, very fundamental source for local history. But they're mostly only available via, now digitally, via those sorts of services. So they've kind of fallen a little bit off the radar as a result. And those kind of tendencies, you see that particularly with newspapers, historic newspapers, where it's quite fragmented coverage and bits and pieces all over the place.
Yes, I mean that feeds into, I mean, the whole. It's another discussion. In fact, something that is very much on the minds of many at the moment is this idea of standardization, or at least standardization and discoverability, those two key parts of the way that...
It's very difficult though. I mean, I think that, and it's something that is really pushed, but bearing in mind the fundamentally different character of archives and library collections, actually trying to yoke the two together in terms of discoverability is a real problem. If you want to navigate your way around an administrative archive, you need to understand its administrative structure, and it's going to be so huge that it's going to be like what I've got behind me here, that you're not going to actually kind of say who every scribe is, what every name is that appears in it. The only way of navigating yourself very successfully around is to have a clear statement of the administrative structure. That's what the archival standards like ISAD-G and EAD are geared up in order to deal with. But if you've got something like the British Library, a small select collection, in those cases you would expect much more cataloguing at a level of item level,
Right.
and though it's miscellaneous character, it's much more like conventional library cataloguing than archival cataloguing. In any case, I think there has to be an imperative to do that when you spent very large amounts of public money acquiring that material.
Right. I think one of the things, just like talking to you for the last sort of 35 minutes, whatever, has shown me arguably more clearly than even experience itself over the last decades is the fundamental distinctions between the archive and the library, because there is a tendency to downplay that, or to say, for example, our library here has got documents X, Y, and Z, and that archive over there has something that could easily be kept in a library. But actually those are not the kind of general bread and butter of these institutions, organizations, in terms of their collections, right? They are fundamentally different.
And I mean, if anybody, I don't know whether you have the same difficulties that I often experience trying to use the current online catalogue for archives and manuscripts for the British Library, which is very difficult to navigate your way around. The reason for that is that the British Library contains one of the greatest archives in the India Office Library and Records in its Oriental collections, which is the archive of the British administration in India. So it's a huge and very important archive, which is structured like a conventional archive as an administrative output. And by the side, it's got one of the great manuscript libraries in the world. The problem with in my view, with the current British Library catalogue is that it is an archive structured catalogue, fundamentally structured to explore the India Office Library and Records. And it consequently works very awkwardly with the British, the Western manuscript collection. And you can't make the two work together very satisfactorily, in my view, at this stage. Maybe projects will come along that will get around those, but the fundamental organisation of them is very different, and it's very difficult to yoke them together.
That's fascinating. So we'll close because, in fact, you have just given us a tip when we're looking at the British Library catalogue about how it can be incredibly tricky for researchers. So if you had a tip for students or engaged members of the public who are coming into contact with historical documents for the first time, what would that tip be?
Well, I think for everybody, if you're working with medieval material, the first thing is it's always rather terrifying to read it. And I remember the first time I'd been to the paleography classes with Julian Brown, very well trained. But the first time I attempted to read a court roll in the Public Record Office, as it then was in Chancery Lane, I remember vividly I couldn't make head nor tail of it. And I thought, this is all, you know, I got my grant for 3 years as a postgraduate, and this is all going to be a complete disaster because I'll never manage it. I think that's the first hurdle, and it's actually a hurdle you'll encounter even if you're dealing with 19th century material, because material written with a 19th century steel pen can be just as illegible as in fact, even more illegible than the 14th century. I think it's about preparing yourself and expecting it to be difficult, and persevering in order, because I did obviously persevere to get to grips with it. Because I remember that as being the most demanding aspect from my point of view. Once I got over that stumbling block, it was really a question, I've always found it interesting to explore around the archive and try and understand its structure and its history as best I can. Because I think that actually enables you to navigate your way around it effectively.
That's wonderful, very, very helpful, and absolutely, I think that is a great tip. And so I just want to finish by showing everybody I think this is your most recent of 9 million publications. I think it's the most recent.
No, well, they tend to come out, but it's a recent publication, yes.
And I just want to recommend this because it's absolutely brilliant. And there's some great essays in it, and particularly Andrew's own essay, Community Archives and the Health of the Internet, which is, I think, a must read. Everybody should read that essay to get a sense of the issues.
I'm very pleased to have done that book because the tradition I came from and was inspired by, which is the sort of classic British Public Record Office, National Archives, top-down Hilary Jenkinson tradition, a sort of expression of civil service, British civil service power and complacency, if ever there was one, is something that has been upended quite radically in the archive profession over the past 10 or 15 years by the community archives movement. To my mind, a whole community archives movement is one of the most radical professional changes I've ever seen. And so I particularly enjoyed doing that book because it's about coming to terms with completely new wave of archival activity that's challenging and rethinking a lot of the things that I grew up with, that I've described, and have been very important in the past.
And it's in a new series, Connected Communities, which is from the University of Bristol, I think, and it's a really lovely publication. It's beautifully produced, so I do recommend that. Andrew, Professor Prescott, sir, thank you so very, very much. And Andrew's work is widely available, and he's incredibly prolifically well published. So do look up Andrew's work. And you have a blog called Digital Riffs.
Yeah, I haven't done much with it for a while, and I need to get back to it. It's just been a bit busy. That's all.
But it is still there. Okay, thank you, Andrew. Thanks ever so much.
Okay. Bye.